Before we get started, I do have this trick that will work on all questions about appositives. Now you don't need to know what they are, but you might remember something about them because we did do a lot of no red ink on them. But like the thing is, on the SAT, it's so much easier than what we did in no red ink. Because all you need to know is that whenever there's a title and a name, there's no punctuation at all. So here in this sentence, my teacher Mr. Van is cool. The title would be teacher, and the name would be Mr. Van. And you wouldn't need any punctuation at all in this sense. So here's another example, but without even being given the sense, you can get the correct answer by just looking at the answer choice. So in all of our answer choices, musician is the title, and Grand Perez is the name. So we have a title plus a name, which means we're going to be using no punctuation. That means the only answer could be A. Here are 39 practice problems on punctuation. As per usual, I'll link these questions and the answer key in the description, so if you want to work ahead, you can go ahead and do so. But if you need a little bit more help, I will be going through every single question, or if you need further clarification, feel free to ask me. Before we get started, I do want to say that the first thing you should always do is read the answer choices, because most of the time, you can get the correct answer without even needing to read the text. Anyways, let's get started with question number 1. First up, look at our answer choices, and you'll notice that this is going to be an appositive question. We have our title, entomologist, and our name, Heather Grab. So what do we do when we have an appositive question? Choose the answer choice without any punctuation. So the answer choice without any punctuation is C. So that means C will be our answer. Question number 2. Let's look at our answer choices. You notice here that there's a period and a semicolon. Now both of these have the exact same function, they both connect independent clauses. This means we can instantly get rid of both of them because they both do the exact same thing. Now it's between whether we use no punctuation or a comma. And I'll tell you right now, 90% of the time, it's never going to be the answer without any punctuation. However, just to be sure, let's look at our text and see if it would make sense to include a comma. The thing about punctuation is that most of the time they're gonna come in pairs. So if you see a dash, there's usually 2 dashes, and if you see a comma, there's usually 2 commas. So on these types of punctuation questions, what I like to do is scan through the text quickly and just look for commas. So here, there's a comma right here, and there's also a comma right here. So these two would go together in a pair. And then if we keep going, there's also a comma all the way down here. Once again, most of the time this comma should be in a pair. So let's see if it would make sense if we put it in a pair with this comma right here. Now it is definitely very possible that this last part is its own dependent clause, but it's also very possible that the part in the middle is the dependent clause. So that's when you would plug in your answer choice and see if it would make sense to include a comma there. Alright, so I went ahead and just typed it in that little box right there. And you'll see that these 2 commas would set this middle part off as a dependent clause. And what dependent clauses do is that they just add on extra information to what was said before. So what you want to do is look right before the comma, and you'll see that the topic right before that was contemporary writers. So then we would look at our dependent clause, and does this dependent clause add on to information about contemporary writers? Yes, it does. It gives an example of a contemporary writer, which is this one person right here, Tiju Cole. So D would be our answer, we would use a comma in this case. Question number 3. Let's look at our answer choices. There's a semicolon right here, and none of the other answer choices have a period or comma in a fanboy. Whenever this happens, the first thing you want to do is quickly skim through the text and see if there's another semicolon. So here I'm skimming through the text and I notice there's a semicolon right here. So whenever there's a semicolon in your text, you always choose the answer that also has a semicolon. That means our answer will be B. And the reason for this is because this will be a list with semicolons. Question number 4. Let's look at answer choices. We notice here that there's a comma and a dash. And just like in question number 2, as I said, whenever you see these punctuation, most of the time they're gonna come in pairs. So what you want to do is you want to look for another comma or another dash in our sentence or in our text. Here I'm skimming through our text and I notice that there's a dash right here. And once again, 9 times out of 10, this will end in a pair. Now, it's very possible that this single dash could set off this entire chunk of text as a dependent clause. But it's also very possible that it just sets off this middle chunk of text as a dependent clause. Now, there's only 2 possible answer choices from here. we're either going to use another dash so we can pair it up with this dash, or we're going to use no punctuation at all. And as I said before, it's basically never going to be the answer without any punctuation, so you are safe to just go ahead and circle D at this point. But there's also a very easy way to check. The thing about dependent clauses is that they just add on extra info to the sense. They're not actually important to the main meaning of the sense. What does that mean? What I'm trying to say is that you can't cross it out entirely from the sense, and it should still make sense. So let's try doing that. So I went ahead and inserted our answer choice into the blank right there, and this would become our dependent clause theoretically. So if we just cross out this entire chunk of text, the sentence should still make sense even though we got rid of that dependent clause. And let's see. This guy led armies against the Spanish, liberating 3 territories from colonial rule. That still sounds good to me. So that means that entire middle chunk of text was a dependent clause, so D would be our answer. It would make sense to put a dash there. Question number 5. Let's look at our answer choices. You should notice that there's a period and a semicolon. Now, unlike question number 2, we can't instantly get rid of both of these because they're not in the same spot. I mean, the period is after the word hi, and then the semicolon is after the word on. Then you also notice that there's an answer choice with a colon. That doesn't really tell you anything, but you should keep an eye out for that. Now, we didn't get anything crazy from our answer choices, so the best step to do after this is just plug in each of your answer choices and see what would make the most sense. So I went ahead and plugged in answer choice A, which uses a period. And the thing about a period is it connects 2 independent clauses or 2 complete sentences. So we have to check, is everything before the period a complete sentence? And is everything after the period a complete sentence? I'm gonna just check everything after the period real quick because, I mean, it's only 4 words compared to everything before, which is like 25 words, so on openness to experience. Alright, I think it's pretty obvious that is not a complete sentence, so A cannot be our answer. Alright, so I went ahead and plugged in answer choice B, and now we have a semicolon. And just like a period, a semicolon connects 2 independent clauses or 2 complete sentences. So let's check everything after our semicolon and see if that's a complete sentence. Openness to experience. Yeah, that's also not a complete sentence, so B cannot be our answer either. Then we have C, which has no punctuation. And once again, it's basically never going to be the answer without any punctuation. So I'm not even going to bother checking that, but if you did plug that in without any punctuation, then most likely it just turned into a run-on sentence, so it's not going to be C. Which means our answer is probably D, where we use a colon. But let's check and see if a colon would make sense in this situation. Alright, I went ahead and plugged in answer choice D, and the thing about a colon is that it connects an independent clause, or a complete sentence, with anything else. Alright, so the thing after the colon could be an independent clause, a complete sentence, or it could be an incomplete sentence, it could be a fragment, it could be a list, it could be an explanation, it could be anything, alright? So the only important thing is that everything before it is a complete sentence. So let's check that. Alright, so everything before the colon is a complete sentence, and you also notice that here it says that there was one personality trait that they scored particularly high on, and then after the colon it does explain what that trait is, which is openness to experience. So everything before the colon, complete sentence, everything after the colon, just an explanation. So yes, a colon would make sense in this case. Question number 6. Let's look at our answer choices. There's not really anything notable here, except we do see that only one answer choice has a period. Now, call me a mastermind or call me crazy, but it's a pretty safe gamble that if there's only one answer choice that has a semicolon, a period, or a comma fanboy, or something that connects 2 independent sentences, it's most likely going to be the answer. So since only one answer choice has a period, I'm pretty sure it's going to be B, but let's actually check if that would make sense here. So we know that periods connect 2 complete sentences. So first we have to check out, is this even a complete sentence? Hopefully by now you know what makes a complete sentence. A complete sentence needs a noun and a verb. So let's check. In our sentence, we have a noun right here, which is a clipper ship. And then we have our verb, it entered. So we do have a complete sentence. And guess what? If there's a complete sentence, if you don't have a period, then all of these would just make it a run-on sentence. We can also check this by just seeing if everything after is also a complete sentence. And then you would also notice that all the way down here, the celebrated ship, that's a noun, and set a record, that's the verb. So it would be 2 complete sentences. And what do you need to do to connect 2 complete sentences? You need a period, a semicolon, or a comma and a fanboy. which means our answer will be B. Question number 7. Let's look at our answer choices. Here you should notice this is going to be an appositive question because compound is going to be our title, and then aluminum oxide is going to be our name. So whenever we have an appositive question, you want to choose the one that has no punctuation. That means our answer will be D. Question number 8. Let's look at our answer choices. Now straight off the bat, they don't really tell us much, but if you're to quickly plug our answer choices into the blank here in the text, then you would notice that A would end up having a comma and a fanboy. And you should note that a comma and a fanboy is used to combine two complete sentences. Then if you look at C, you also see a semicolon. And you should also know a semicolon is also used to combine two complete sentences. Now they both do the exact same function, so how do you choose between the two of them? The answer is, you simply just can't. That means that neither of them will be the answer, so we can go ahead and cross off A and C. Now it's between using a colon or no punctuation at all. And as I've said a million times, 90% of the time it's never going to be the answer without any punctuation. But just to check, let's go ahead and look at the sentence with the blank. Now once you finish reading that, you should notice that it's just a list with 2 items. The team was able to determine, here's our first item, how current-driven mixing varies, and then here's our second item, the impact it has on the distribution of heat and nutrients. Now in a list with 3 items, you need commas to separate each of the items. However, in a list with only 2 items, you don't need any punctuation at all. So this is going to be one of those small exceptions where you actually use no punctuation at all. So since our example in the text is a list with 2 items, our answer will be D because we don't want to use any punctuation. Question number 9. Let's look at our answer choices. There's not really anything crazy here, but once again, we do see only one answer choice with something that connects 2 independent clauses. So here we have a period. This means that it's most likely going to be the answer, but let's go ahead and check that. We know that a period connects 2 independent clauses or 2 complete sentences. So we're going to check on both sides of the period. So really we'd be checking on both sides of the blank. Is all of this a complete sentence, everything after? And is all of this a complete sentence, everything before? And to do that, you should know what a complete sentence is made of, a noun and a verb. So let's look for a noun and a verb. Alright, so this researcher, that's going to be our noun, and he developed something, that is a verb. Now let's look after the blank. You have the researcher again, that's going to be our noun, and then increased, that's going to be our verb. So yes, these are both complete sentences, and to connect 2 complete sentences, we would need to use a period. So that means our answer will be D. Question number 10. Let's look at answer choices. Once again, we only have one answer choice with a piece of punctuation that connects 2 complete sentences. Now, in our previous questions, there were 2. We only had one answer choice with a period. In this question, we have one answer choice with a semicolon. But remember, a period and a semicolon and a comma and a fanboy, they all do the exact same thing. They all connect 2 complete sentences. 90% chance this is going to be the answer, but let's go ahead and check it. And we can do that by looking at both sides of the blank. We're going to look before the blank and check if that's a complete sentence, and then look after the blank and check if this is a complete sentence. So let's go ahead and look for our nouns and our verbs. Sable, this person, that's going to be our noun, and then is going to be our verb. And then if we look after our blank, she, that is going to be our noun, and now our verb is a little hidden. You notice that there's an apostrophe s here, which makes this a contraction. And hopefully you remember that whenever you have an apostrophe s, that's just short for is. And once again, is will be our verb. So we do have another complete sentence, it's just that the verb is a little hidden inside of that apostrophe s. Alright, in our text we have 2 complete sentences, so to connect those 2, we would need to use a semicolon, which means our answer will be C. Question number 11. Let's look at our answer choices. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can instantly cross off or instantly choose. That means we'll have to be doing a little bit more thinking on this question. The best way to move forward from here is to just plug in every single answer choice and see if it makes sense. Let's go ahead and plug in A. So I went ahead and plugged in A, and now let's see if this sentence would make sense. Now we used a colon here, and you should remember the most important condition to use a colon is that everything before the colon needs to be a complete sentence. So let's go ahead and check if that part before the colon is a complete sentence. So the number of jams, that would be our noun, and then varied, that would be our verb. So that does check out. Now usually everything after a colon is either going to be an explanation or a list, but it could really be anything. Let's go ahead and read it. Some shoppers had 24 different options, others only 6. So here it's an explanation. In the sentence before the colon, it said the number of jams varied, and then it explained on that, it elaborated on that, by saying that some had more options and some had less. So in this case, a colon would make sense. Before the colon, there's a complete sentence, and then after the colon, there's an explanation. So A will be our answer. Now there's actually a second way that you could have gotten this answer. If you look after the blank, you'll notice that it's also a complete sentence. Some shoppers, that's going to be our noun. And then had is going to be our verb. So here we have two complete sentences. And you should remember the three main ways to connect two complete sentences: a period, a semicolon, or a comma, and a fanboy. And if you look at all of our other answer choices, none of them have any of those. So these would just result in a comma splice or a run-on sentence. So now you might be thinking, okay, cool, we got rid of B, C, and D, but why does that make A our answer? Why can't we use a colon even though we're only supposed to be using a period, a semicolon, or a comma and a fanboy to connect two complete sentences? Well, the most important thing about colons is that everything before the colon needs to be a complete sentence, as I've said before. Everything after can be whatever. It can be an explanation or a list, like I've said, but it could also be a complete sentence or an incomplete sentence. In the last question we had on colons, you'll notice that everything after the colon was an incomplete sentence. I mean, openness to experience, that is not a complete sentence. In our current question, everything after the colon is, however, a complete sentence. So that's why we can use a colon in this case. Sometimes colons can be used to connect two complete sentences, but that's only if the two sentences connect. So for example, if the second sentence was an explanation to the first, or if it was a list expanding on the first. So yes, it's a very weird rule and a very weird exception. That's why most of the time, I really only tell you to ever use a period, a semicolon, or a comma in a fanboy. Question number 12. Let's look at answer choices. You should notice here that there's one with a semicolon and one with a period. And under normal circumstances, we would be able to get rid of the both of them because they would do the exact same thing. However, they aren't doing the exact same thing here, and you can tell because if you look at A, it has the word by right after it. And if you look at C, there's no word by after it. So since they aren't the exact same sense, they aren't doing the exact same thing, which means we can't get rid of them just yet. Now I will tell you that whenever you have a semicolon by itself, a colon by itself, or a period by itself, most likely that's going to be the answer because they're trying to test you if you know how to use those pieces of punctuation. Of course, this rule wouldn't apply when there's both a semicolon and a period because usually you would just cross them both out. However, in this question, since we aren't crossing them out, that means that most likely our answer will either be A or C. So whenever we can't cross something out, our next best step is to just plug in the answer choices. And we want to plug in A and C first. So let's go ahead and plug in A. Alright, I went ahead and plugged in A. Our punctuation is a semicolon, which means that everything before the semicolon needs to be a complete sentence. It needs to have a noun and a verb. And everything after also needs to be a complete sentence. It needs to have a noun and a verb. So let's go ahead and find our noun and verb. Dark rooftops, that's going to be our noun. And absorb is going to be our verb. Now let's look after the semicolon. The first thing you want to notice is at the very beginning of the sentence, we have the two words by added. Now whenever you have the word by plus a verb that ends in ing, it turns that part of a sentence into a modifier. And modifiers on the SAT are almost always, dare I say 100% of the time, going to be separated with a comma. So if we look at the beginning of our sentence, you'll see that there's a comma right here, which means that this entire part of the sentence is going to be a modifier. Now, why is this important? What even is a modifier? Well, if you think about it, a modifier modifies the meaning of a sentence. Okay, but seriously though, what a modifier does is it just adds on extra details. Take this sense for example. Quick and brown would be the modifier for fox. It adds on extra details to what the fox is, while the fox is quick and it's also brown. And then look at lazy. That's also a modifier for dog. It adds on extra details to what the dog is lazy. Now obviously this is extremely simple. In fact, you already know what modifiers are. They're really just adjectives and adverbs. However, on the SAT, they're not just gonna throw some 2-word adjectives onto you. They're gonna make it extremely long by adding a whole really long phrase and then separating it with a comma. So that's why it looks a little bit different. Okay, cool. We know what a modifier is now, but why is it even important that we know that it's a modifier? Well, let's look at our example real quick. The modifier comes first, and then the noun comes after it. Once again, the modifier comes first, and then the noun comes after it. We can apply this logic to our question. The modifier comes first, which is by adding a light color covering to an existing dark roof, and then after it is where we'll find the noun. So that extremely long explanation on what a modifier is was just to say that we can basically get rid of this entire first part of our sentence. We know that that first part is a modifier, so we don't need to be reading any of that since we know our noun won't be in there. It's gonna follow after. Now that we're done with our extremely long explanation on what a modifier is, let's move on to the rest of our sentence. The next thing you want to notice is that you have 2 commas right here. A comma here and a comma here. And usually what that does is that if there's 2 commas placed in the middle of a sentence, that's going to be a dependent clause. And just like a modifier, it adds on extra details to the sentence. Why is that important? Well, we know that a modifier comes first and a noun comes after because the modifier adds on meaning to the noun. Let's apply the same logic. The dependent clause comes first and then the noun comes after because the dependent clause adds on meaning to the noun. Once again, another long explanation on what a dependent clause is, just to say we can completely get rid of this part of the sentence since it's a dependent clause and we won't find a noun there either. Okay, finally, let's do a quick recap in case you either didn't understand some part in that long ramble or you decided to just skip to this part and ignore all the explanation. When we look after our semicolon, this first part of the section is a modifier, so we can completely cross that out since the noun and verb won't be in that section. Next up, this section right here, separated by 2 commas, is going to be a dependent clause. And once again, we won't find our noun or verb in this part either, so we can go ahead and cross that out. That means that finally, our noun and verb should be in these last 4 words of the sentence. Look at that. We managed to shorten that entire long sentence into just 4 words. Now let's look for our noun and verb. Okay, so I see our verb is going to be helps combat. But unfortunately, we don't have a noun, so guess what? Since this second part of the sentence isn't an independent clause, it isn't a complete sentence, that means that A cannot be our answer since the semicolon is not joining 2 complete sentences. It's joining 1 complete sentence and 1 fragment. How exciting! We went through that whole long process just to find out A wasn't the answer. Alright, now let's plug in answer choice C. We already established that everything before the piece of punctuation is a complete sentence. There's a noun and a verb, the noun is dark rooftops, and the verb is absorb. Now let's look at everything after our piece of punctuation, which is in this case a period. Just like a semicolon, it should combine 2 complete sentences. Last time in answer choice A, the second part wasn't a complete sentence. So what makes this answer choice any different? Well, the key difference is actually the very first thing that we noticed, which is that answer choice A had the word by, and answer choice C does not. And in case you skipped the explanation on modifiers, let me quickly reiterate. Whenever you have the word by, followed by a verb that ends in ing, it turns that part of a sentence into a modifier. However, this time we don't have the word by in our sentence. We just have adding by itself. And this actually makes adding the subject of the sentence. Because whenever you have verbs that end in ing just by themselves, not paired with another word like by, for example, they can actually function as the noun. And this is what's known as a gerund. So now we know that adding is going to be the noun in this sense, We note that this is still our dependent clause, so we can just cross it out. And of course, we also know that helps combat is our verb. So now we finally have two complete sentences on both sides of the punctuation. And that means that C will be our answer because in this case, a period would effectively combine two independent clauses because they both have nouns and verbs on both sides. How exciting. That took way too long. Alright, so if that explanation was still a little bit confusing to you, here's another example that works pretty much the exact same as the question, but a lot shorter. So I have two sentences here, and if you can tell, the first sentence mocks answer choice A because it has the word by followed by our verb that ends in ing. And then of course the second sentence would mock answer choice C because it just has the verb that ends in ing by itself without anything in front of it. Of course, we know that the first sentence, because it's a modifier, we're missing a subject. We only have the verb helps. But if you also just read it, it doesn't quite sound right. By buying Minh-Hieu Marvel Rivals skins helps me get private tutoring. It doesn't really flow nicely, it doesn't make sense. It feels like something's missing, which obviously something is, it's the noun that's missing. And then of course, if you look at answer choice C, we know that buying would be our noun, and then helps would be our verb. And if you also read it, buying Minh-Hieu Marvel Rivals skins helps me get private tutoring. Now that sounds a lot better. Alright, now if you actually wanted to use a modifier like in answer choice A, this is what it would look like. Of course, I had to move some words around because I did need to add in that noun, but it still keeps the meaning of the sentence somewhat the same. By buying Minh-Hieu Marvel Rivals skins, I can get private tutoring. That sounds a whole lot better than by buying Minh-Hieu Marvel Rivals skins helps me get private tutoring. And of course, we have our noun, which is I, and can get is obviously going to be our verb. So that would be a complete sentence. Anyways, more than just using this as an example, please hashtag hook me up in Marvel Rivals. Anyone? Hello? Am I muted? Question number 13. Let's look at our answer choices. We have a new type of question here, and I like to call these questions transition questions. Now I might be asking, why are there transition words on a set of questions made for punctuation? And your answer to that is that they're not actually testing you on what the transition word means. Instead, they're testing you on what punctuation should go around it. Now the first trick I want to tell you is that on these types of questions, 99% of the time, the answer is going to have a semicolon. If you look at A, it has a semicolon. And if you look at B, it has a semicolon. However, if you look at C and D, they don't have semicolons, so they're most likely not going to be our answer. Now here's the fun and tricky part. Where should the semicolon go? In A, the semicolon comes after the transition word. In B, the semicolon comes before the transition word. And now we have to find out which one is going to be the right placement. Now here comes the second trick. The first one is that it should include a semicolon. And the second one is that 99% of the time, the semicolon will always come after the transition word. So that means that most likely our answer will be A. But let me also explain to you why this is the case. So here I wrote down two example sentences that basically mimic the ones in our question as well as our answer choices. If you can tell, our first sentence is going to mimic answer choice A because the semicolon comes after the transition word. And then the second sentence will mimic answer choice B because the semicolon comes before the transition word. Now the thing that you should know about transition words is that they will always modify the meaning of the idea that comes before it. Now here's the tricky part, and that's when we're trying to find what is that idea we're trying to modify. But there is actually a pretty easy way to find out. Whenever your semicolon is after the transition word, that idea you're trying to modify is usually just going to be the word that's right before the transition word, or maybe like a few words. So in this case, the idea we're trying to modify is alone, because it's directly before our transition word, however. Now whenever your semicolon is before the transition word, the idea you're trying to modify is going to be that entire part that's before the semicolon. So instead of just being one word like it is up here, it's going to be this entire section. So now we know what idea our transition word is trying to modify. Now the second thing you need to know is how it's going to modify that idea. Whenever your semicolon is after the transition word, your transition word is just adding detail to the idea. It's just clarifying the idea. Whenever your semicolon is before the transition word, then the transition word is going to apply to the entire idea, the entire sentence that comes before it. Now that we know all of this, let's actually look at the example we have and put all the dots together. Let's look at our first example. Minh-Hieu doesn't queue Marvel Rivals ranked alone, however, he also plays with Michaela. So we already established that the semicolon comes after the transition word, which means that the idea that's being modified is only going to be a few words or the word that's before it. Now we also know that the way it's being modified is that it's just adding on a little bit of information to it. So let's put this all together. I don't play Marvel Rivals ranked alone. Now let me add a little bit of detail to that. I also play with Michaela. That's how that transition word is being used. And does it make sense? Yeah. I don't play alone because I play with someone else. Both of those match up and they make sense. So that's why A would be our answer. That's why the semicolon would come after the transition word. Now let's look at our second example. Minh-Hieu doesn't queue Marvel Rivals ranked alone. However, he also plays with Michaela. So we know that the semicolon comes before the transition word, which means that the idea that's being modified is going to be that entire clause, that entire sentence that comes before the semicolon. And now, since it's no longer just one word that's being modified, it's that entire section before the semicolon that's being modified, we're going to use our transition word to change its meaning. And in this case, however, would be used to contrast something or contradict something. Let's look at the first part of our sentence. I don't play ranked alone. And then the second part is that I play with someone else. Whenever I use this transition word however right here to change the meaning of this first idea, I'm basically saying that, hey look, this first idea that I mentioned should be the exact opposite of the second idea or everything that comes after the semicolon. But is that the case? I don't play ranked alone and I play with someone else. Are these two things opposite of each other? They aren't. If anything, they mean the exact same thing. By putting that semicolon before the transition word, I'm saying that these two things should be the opposite of each other and that they should contradict. But in reality, these two ideas don't contradict. That's why it wouldn't make sense to use a semicolon before. And instead, it would be better to use a semicolon after, because then I would just be explaining how I don't play ranked alone, I actually play with someone else. Alright, so here's another example where the semicolon comes before the transition word. So we know that the idea that's being modified is going to be this entire sentence. And in this case, it would make sense for it to work this way. Why? Well, let's check it out. Does the first idea, which is everything before the semicolon, contradict with the second idea, which is everything after the semicolon? Well, here's the first idea. I prefer queuing ranked alone. And here's my second idea. Someone else often plays with me anyways. Yes, these two things do contradict with each other. I want to play alone, but I end up not alone, or I end up playing with someone else. Those two things do contradict, contrast, are the opposite of each other, whatever you want to say, so it would make sense to put that semicolon before the transition word. But of course, all of that was just to show you when you actually would put a semicolon before the transition word. But once again, 99% of the time, you're gonna be safe just choosing the answer choice that has the semicolon after the transition word. Alright lads and lasses, now it's time to actually answer the question after that super long explanation. Now if you didn't understand some part of the explanation, or if you decided to just skip it entirely, here's a quick recap. Whenever the semicolon is after the transition word, like in A, it's going to be adding extra details to the idea that comes before it. Now whenever your semicolon is before the transition word, like it is in B, it's going to be changing the meaning of the entire idea that comes before. So it's going to be applying that transition word to the entire idea. Now in this case, our transition word is however, so that means that the idea that comes before it should be the exact opposite. But if you had a different transition word, like for example, then that means that the entire idea that comes before it should be an example that matches to whatever greater category or group it belongs to. Now let's plug our answer choices into the text and see which one would make more sense. Are we A, adding on extra information, or B, making two things sound the exact opposite of each other, making two things contradict each other? Alright, so I plugged in A, now let's read it. This guy doesn't make decisions by himself, however. All of these designations must be approved by a group of 9 other people. So, is this adding on extra information? Well, let's see. He doesn't make these decisions by himself. Let me add more details. These decisions must be approved by a group of 9 other people. Yeah, it's adding on more details. He's not doing it by himself. Actually, there's even more people that need to be a part of that decision-making process. So it would make sense to put that semicolon after the transition word. Now let's say we put the semicolon before the transition word. Would these two ideas contradict each other? He doesn't make decisions by himself. These decisions are made by a group of 9 other people. Yeah, no, these two things aren't the opposite of each other. They mean the exact same thing, so it wouldn't make sense to put that semicolon before the transition word. How exciting! All of that just to prove that our answer is A, where the semicolon comes after the transition word, which is what I said would happen 99% of the time anyway. But of course, it is important to understand the shortcuts that you're using. I guess if you really wanted to get all the points, but if you're really just shooting for like a 1400, you don't really need to know. Just always go for the easy shortcut, because then you wouldn't need to study for as long. Question number 14. Let's look at our answer choices. Once again, we have a transition type question on the punctuation part of the SAT. So let's apply our two tricks that we know. First one is that the answer is usually going to have a semicolon, and the second one is that the semicolon is usually going to be after the transition word. So that means our answer is A. But as per usual, let me quickly prove it. I went ahead and plugged in A, and here our semicolon is after the transition word, which means that the transition word should just be adding on some extra details to the idea that comes before it. So let's check if that's the case. This person doesn't just compile the information. Let me add more details. She also shares her findings with these farmers. Did it add more details? Yes, it did. So that means A would be our answer. That would be the best spot to put that semicolon. Now for funsies, let's say I plugged in C, where the semicolon is before the transition word. And if we did this, that means the transition word would apply to the idea. So here our transition word is though, which is also another contrasting transition. So basically, the transition word should apply to the idea, means that everything before the semicolon should contradict everything that comes after the semicolon. Now let's check if that's the case. This person doesn't just compile the information, she also shares her findings with these farmers. Are these two ideas the opposite of each other? No, they're not. They actually mean the exact same thing, and that's why it wouldn't make sense to put our semicolon before the transition word, so that's why C would be wrong and A is our answer. Question number 15, let's look at our answer choices. We have a comma and a fanboy, a semicolon, and a period. All three of those have the exact same function, and of course, as we saw in question number 13, sometimes we can't get rid of them instantly. However, this question we can, because all of them look the exact same. I mean, they all have the word the after them. Nothing else changes, other than the comma and the fanboy, but I mean, that's the fanboy, that's the whole point. Anyways, once again, they all connect to independent clauses or to complete sentences. They all do the exact same function. None of them do it better than the other, so we wouldn't really be able to choose between any of them, which means we don't choose any of them at all. So we can go ahead and cross all those out, and our answer will be B. Question number 16, let's go ahead and look at our answer choices. You'll notice here that there's only one answer choice that has a period. And as I've said before, whenever you only have one answer choice that has a period, semicolon, or a colon, most of the time that's going to be the answer, because that's what they're testing you on. They're trying to find out if you know how to use a period, semicolon, or colon. That means our best bet is to plug in answer choice D and see if it would work. I went ahead and plugged in answer choice D. Here our piece of punctuation is a period which connects two independent clauses or two complete sentences. So we have to make sure that everything before the period is a complete sentence, has a noun and a verb, and everything after the period is a complete sentence, has a noun and a verb. So let's go ahead and start looking. So here you'll notice that at the very start of this sentence right here, Oh, sorry, I guess it would be down here. It starts off with the word like, and then it also has a comma. So this is actually going to be a modifier, which means we won't find our noun or verb here. Now you don't need to know that. You'd probably be able to find a noun and a verb even without crossing that out, because the noun would be an Elvis taxon, and our verb would be is not. Alright, now let's look after our period. Let's see if there's a noun and a verb. It, that is going to be our noun, and then is, that is going to be our verb. So yes, there are two complete sentences, so we would in fact need a period to connect those two complete sentences, which means our answer will be D. Question number 17, let's look at our answer choices. You notice here that our answer choices have semicolons. Now we've seen 3 uses of semicolons so far. The first time is when we see it when we're connecting two independent clauses. The second time is in transition questions. And now for the third time, it's going to be used in a complex list. Now you can quickly confirm that this is going to be a complex list by looking inside of the text. If there's at least one semicolon that they use in the text, excluding the one that you'd put in the blank, it will 100% be a complex list with semicolons. So let's quickly look through our text, and you'll notice here that there is going to be a semicolon. Now if we plug in one of our answer choices, theoretically, we would also have a semicolon here. So we have 2 semicolons, making this a complex list with semicolons. Now you might be wondering, what even is a complex list with semicolons? Well, it's actually pretty easy. It's pretty much just a list like you normally would have with commas, except instead of commas, you're replacing them with a semicolon. What you're usually used to is going to be the top example, most likely, a list with commas, but in a complex list, you replace those commas with semicolons. How exciting. Now the reason you would use semicolons instead of commas is when you already have other commas in a sentence that would kind of confuse things up. So here's an example. Whenever you're writing the location of a city, usually you write the city name, comma, the country. Now let's say instead of semicolons, you've replaced it with a comma. Now you just have literally 6 commas in a row, and you wouldn't know if the city belonged to the country or if you're trying to separate one city from the next city. And whenever that happens, it causes a lot of confusion. So instead of using a comma, you would use a semicolon to separate these different cities. Now that we know how these lists work, we want to find out what info belongs to which item. So let's call this the first item, the second item, and the third item. We have to find out where the best spot to put the semicolon would be. For example, let's say I moved around the semicolon and commas like this, where now it would be the semicolon after Chicago. And of course, this would make it sound like France is a city in Chicago. Obviously, that doesn't match. France should be going with Paris, and Chicago should be going with Illinois. That's the type of thinking you want to have when you're approaching these problems. Now what we're going to do is plug in our answer choices and see which info should go with which item. Make sure that the ideas match up. Alright, as I've said this a million times before, whenever you have these types of questions, if there's a semicolon, colon, or a period, that's usually going to be your answer. So since B and C both have a semicolon, we know that most likely it's going to be one of those two. So we don't need to bother plugging in A or D. We only need to check B and C. Alright, so I went ahead and plugged in answer choice B. Now let's read this out and see if it would make sense. These 2 gardens are 2 of many gardens around the world dedicated to growing diverse plant species, both native and non-native, fostering scientific research, and educating the public about plant conservation. So when we put the semicolon after both native and non-native like this, we're saying that both native and non-native would be adding on extra details to the idea right before it, which would be diverse plant species. Now would this make sense? Would there be both native and non-native plant species? Yeah, that would indeed make sense. That means our answer would be B. Now if you didn't understand the way I explained that, let me plug in C and show you why C would be wrong. Alright, so I went ahead and plugged in C, and now that we have the semicolon before our idea, that means that the idea is going to be applying to what's after it, what's after the comma. So you can basically think of the semicolon as a wall, alright? It doesn't interfere with the info on the other side. Real quick, using that same analogy, this is answer choice B, the correct answer choice. Think of the semicolon as a wall. It wouldn't interfere with the info on the other side, so native and non-native would apply to plant species. Now let's look back at C. Let's treat the semicolon as a wall. That means that both native and non-native would apply to fostering scientific research. Would it make sense to foster scientific research that is both native and non-native? No, that doesn't really make sense. Or at least it doesn't sound as good as native and non-native plants. That's why C would not be our answer. Question number 18, let's look at our answer choices. Once again, we have one answer choice with a period. If there's only one answer choice with a period, colon, or semicolon, that's most likely going to be our answer. So we know that most likely D is going to be our answer. But of course, let's go ahead and plug it in and see if it would make sense. Alright, I went ahead and plugged it in. Our punctuation here is a period, which connects two complete sentences. So we should check that everything before the period is complete sentence, which means it has a noun and a verb. And everything after the period is complete sentence, which means it has a noun and a verb. So we have Indian Bengali filmmaker, that person. And also just want to quickly point out, Indian Bengali filmmaker, that's an appositive right there. And notice how in this entire positive, there's no punctuation used. Remember that, guys. Remember that. A title, Indian Bengali filmmaker, and the name should never have punctuation between them on the SAT. Alright, anyways, that is obviously going to be our noun, and then released is going to be our verb. Now let's look after the period. Once again, you notice that there's going to be a comma here, which makes this first part of the sentence actually a dependent clause or modifier because it adds on extra info to the noun. But of course, you don't need to point that out and you won't need to notice that, because I am 100% sure that you would still notice that raised film would be the noun in the second sentence, and then was would be the verb. So yes, both sides have a noun and a verb, both sides are complete sentences, so we would indeed need to use a period to connect these two independent clauses, these two complete sentences, which means our answer will be D. Question number 19, let's look at our answer choices. So here we actually have answer choices with a colon, a semicolon, and a period. Now I usually tell you that whenever any of these are by themselves, like when you only have one period in all four of the answer choices, that's usually going to be the answer. But what happens when you have all three of them in the answer choices? Now we might be getting a little cooked. But of course, I am just kidding. Why? Because we know that periods and semicolons do the exact same thing. Now this isn't like question number 13 or 14, where we had that extra word by that changed the meaning of the sentence. Both of these are the exact same answer choice. They both only have the word geological after them. So since a semicolon and a period do the exact same function, we can go ahead and cross both of these answers out. And now we only need to choose between using no punctuation and a colon. And now we know that most likely the answer is going to be B, because whenever you have a colon in the answer choices, it's most likely going to be the answer. Of course, we're also including the fact that we got rid of the answer with a semicolon and a period. Also, 99% of the time, you're never going to choose the answer without any punctuation. Anyways, let's go ahead and check this by plugging in answer choice B. Alright, I went ahead and plugged in answer choice B, and you should note that a colon is normally used to add a list of things or an explanation of things. Now it could be anything, but those are the main two things that happen. I'll go ahead and make this easy for you. If you look in the sentence right before it, it says that this scientist offers a new explanation of something. Huh, wait, can't you use colons to describe explanations? Yeah, you can, that's kind of the whole point. So it would make sense to use a colon here, because we have an explanation. Boom, there we go, our answer is B. Question number 20, let's look at our answer choices. Now you've heard me say that whenever you have a colon, semicolon, or period by itself in the answer choices, most likely that's going to be the answer. Now we're going to add another item to that list. Whenever you have a comma and a fanboy by itself in the answer choices, that's also most likely going to be the answer. So if we go ahead and look at the answer choices for this question, you'll notice that there's an answer with a comma and a fanboy. And of course, in none of the other answers are there a period, semicolon, or a colon. So most likely, A is going to be our answer. But as per usual, let's go ahead and check that by plugging in answer choice A into the text. Alright, I went ahead and plugged it in, and our punctuation here is a comma and a fanboy, which is used to connect two complete sentences. So let's check. Is everything before the comma and a fanboy a complete sentence? Which means, does it have a noun and a verb? And is everything after the comma and a fanboy a complete sentence? Does it have a noun and a verb? So let's go ahead and find those nouns and verbs. So we have this museum, that's the noun, and it was founded, that's the verb. Now let's look after the comma and a fanboy. It, that is going to be the noun, and is, that's going to be our verb. So yes, we do have two complete sentences, which means we would need that comma and a fanboy to connect these two sentences together. So our answer will be A. Question number 21. Let's look at our answer choices. Once again, whenever you have a colon, semicolon, period, or a comma and a fanboy by itself in all of the answer choices, that's most likely going to be the answer. In this question here, we have one answer choice that has a period. So most likely, D is going to be our answer. But as per usual, let's go ahead and plug it in and check that it would make sense. Alright, I went ahead and plugged in answer choice D. Our punctuation here is a period which connects two complete sentences. So we need to make sure that everything before the period is a complete sentence, which means it has a noun and a verb. And everything after the period is also a complete sentence, which means it has a noun and a verb. So let's start looking for those nouns and verbs. So here we have this poem, that's going to be our noun. And begins is going to be our verb. Now let's look after the period. You notice that there's a comma here, which means this first part is a modifier. But once again, you don't need to know that because I'm sure you would be able to find out that the word is going to be the noun in the second sentence. And was playfully rendered, or really just was, is going to be the verb. So yes, there are two complete sentences, which means to connect those two, we would need to use a period. So that means our answer will be D. Question number 22. Let's look at our answer choices. Once again, our answer choices have semicolons. And if we quickly look at our text, you notice that our text also has another semicolon. So whenever you have at least one semicolon in the text, then also another semicolon in your answer choices, that means that this question will be a complex list with semicolons. Now we know that this is a complex list with semicolons, so obviously our answer choice should have a semicolon. That means we can instantly get rid of A, and we can also get rid of C. Now they do have a colon. Oh, I missed the colon. They do have a colon, but that's not important. We want a semicolon with that comma looking thing at the bottom. Wait, I missed the comma. Now in our last question, the thing that changed between the two answer choices was where the semicolon was placed. Now in this question, you'll notice that the semicolon is placed in the exact same spot, right after the word logos. The only thing that's changing is whether we use a comma or not. Now I've been plugging in the answer choices a lot lately, so I'm getting a little tired of that. So instead, let me show you a different way to go about this question. The first way is the logical way. Most likely, you're going to need to use a comma because once again, the SAT is testing you on punctuation. So you're probably going to need to use punctuation. Also, once again, rarely ever will your answer choice not have punctuation. So when you're faced between using a comma and using no punctuation, most likely you want to use that comma. Now the second way is to think of it as parallel structure. Let's go to our text. You notice that you have this italicized name, and right after it, you have a comma. Right here, you have this italicized name, and right after it, a comma. So if we're following that pattern, we would want to have an italicized name, and after it, a comma. So there you go. Now of course, I'm not going to do it, but if you were to actually plug the text into the blank right here, you would notice that this is just a dependent clause or a modifier, because all it's doing is adding on extra info to the noun. Question number 23, let's look at our answer choices. Here we have another transition type question. However, this one is a little bit different. If you remember our last two transition type questions, which were I think 13 and 14, both of those had semicolons. However, if you look at this question, obviously there are no answer choices with any semicolons at all. That means in this case, we're going to need to be using a different trick. And I've said this trick a million times, and it's that whenever you have a period, semicolon, colon, or a comma in a fanboy, usually that is going to be your answer. So here in this question, answer choice A has a colon, so it's pretty likely that A could be our answer. And then answer choice C has a period, so it's also pretty likely that C could be our answer. So it's going to be between either A or C because they have that colon and period. Now, just like our old transition type questions, we need to figure out where the punctuation goes. In this case, we're not focusing on the fact that it's a colon versus a period, but instead we're looking at the fact that the punctuation comes after the transition word and that the punctuation comes before the transition word. We have to choose which one and where to put it. We're not choosing between using a colon or a period, because in this case it would function the exact same. Now that we whittled down our answers, you should remember that our second trick is that the semicolon usually comes after the transition word. Now in this case we don't have a semicolon, but the message still stays the same. The punctuation that we use should still come after the transition word, which means that most likely our answer will be A. But of course, let's go ahead and check that, and I'll do that by plugging in answer choice A into the text. So I went ahead and plugged in answer choice A, and here our punctuation comes after the transition word, which means that the transition word will only be adding on extra details. So let's go ahead and see if that's the case. Hopper's subsequent career would involve more than just equations though. Let me add some more details. As a pioneering computer programmer, Hopper would help usher in the digital age. Does this add more details? Yeah, it does. It says that they would do more than just equations, and what did they end up doing? Well, they also helped ushering in the digital age. So yes, it would make sense to put the punctuation after the transition word, so it adds on some details. Now for funsies, let's go ahead and say I plugged in answer choice C, where the punctuation comes before the transition word. And this would mean that the transition word would apply to the entire sentence before the punctuation. So it would apply to this entire sentence right here. Here, the transition word is though, and its use is to contrast something or make two things contradict or the opposite of each other. So let's see, would this first idea be the opposite of this second idea right here? And of course, we know that it wouldn't be contradicting each other. We know that these would actually end up supporting each other. He's doing more than just equations. He's also doing something else. These two things are not opposite of each other, so it would not make sense to put that punctuation before the transition word. So that means our best answer would be A. Question number 24. Let's look at our answer choices. Here we only have one answer choice that has a period, so most likely that's going to be our answer. Now let's go ahead and plug that in just to check. I'm sure you know the routine by now. It's a period, so we have to check that both sides have a noun and a verb to make them complete sentences. Let's check before. First up guys, we have a title plus a name. That's an appositive right there. Notice how there's no punctuation. I'm always going to point this out. Anyways, this is our noun, and they recently traveled. That's our verb. Now let's check after the period. Hold on guys real quick as well, comma right here, so you know that this entire thing is a modifier. But of course you wouldn't need to know that, because obviously burial chambers, that's a noun, and seem to do something, that's a verb. So yes, we have two complete sentences, which means we would indeed need to use that period to connect those two. Question number 25. Let's look at our answer choices. Once again, we have only one answer choice that has a period, so most likely that's going to be our answer. But once again, let's go ahead and plug it in just to check. I'm sure you know the routine. It's a period which combines two complete sentences, so we need to make sure both sides have a noun and a verb. First up, let's check before the period. We have American writer, this person. Guys, a title plus a name. Notice how there's no punctuation between them. That's an appositive right there. Anyways, that is our noun. And then guys, we have a clause between two commas. That means that's a dependent clause, so there's no verb or noun in there. So in reality, our verb will actually be has one. But of course, you wouldn't need to know that anyways. I think you can tell that it's gonna be a complete sentence. Anyways, let's go ahead and check after our period. Guys, once again, we have a comma right there, which means this entire thing is a modifier.
But you wouldn't need to know that anyways because Ryder, Robert, and Tony is going to be our noun, and then has is going to be our verb. And don't think I forgot, Ryder is indeed a title, and Robert and Tony is a name. A title plus a name, notice how there's no punctuation, that's a positive right there. Anyways, back to the question at hand, we do indeed have two complete sentences, so yes, we would need to use a period to connect those two clauses, so our answer will be D. Question number 26, let's look at our answer choices. Now, I've usually been saying that whenever you have a semicolon, colon, comma, a fanboy, or a period in your answer choices, that is usually going to be the answer. However, the keyword here is usually. Now, for about the past 10 questions or so, that has been the case. However, as per usual, and with basically everything, there are exceptions, and this question is going to be one of those exceptions. Let me show you real quick by plugging in our answer choice, just a random one. So I went ahead and plugged in the word in the answer choice without any punctuation, and you notice here that American geologist Mary Tharp, American geologist is a title, then Mary Tharp is a name. So whenever you have a title and a name, that's in a positive and you'll never use any punctuation. So this is one of those rare occasions where you won't use any punctuation at all. So our answer will be B. Question number 27. Let's look at our answer choices. As I've been saying, whenever you have a colon, period, semicolon, comma, a fanboy, and I guess even these M dashes, because you don't see those that often, they're usually going to be your answer. However, just like last question, there can be exceptions, and this question will also be one of those exceptions. Now, I went ahead and plugged in our answer without any punctuation, and the reason this works is because gingerbread, or really 2019 novel gingerbread as a whole, is going to be your noun, and then offers is going to be your verb. And you never put any punctuation between a noun and a verb. It's as simple as that. Now, if just memorizing that or thinking of that doesn't make sense to you, let's go through the other answer choices and see why they wouldn't work. And actually, the thing is, you don't even need to go through every single answer choice by itself. The problem is, if you put any piece of punctuation after this noun right here, after the noun gingerbread, what's going to happen is that this part right here is going to act as like a fragment, sort of. I mean, just read it by itself. While her 2019 novel Gingerbread, and then just ends right there. There's no verb to go with it. Because if you put a punctuation after this, it would turn this entire part right here into a dependent clause or a modifier. Because what did they do? Add on extra details to the noun. So since all it's doing is adding on extra details, it's not going to function as a verb. So then you'd just be left with, while her 2019 novel Gingerbread, where's the rest of the sentence at? That's why you can't use any punctuation, and why this question is also one of those rare exceptions where you won't use any punctuation at all. Question number 28. Let's look at our answer choices. Now, I'm not really sure how else to explain it, but the answer is going to be B. And the reason for this is because every single answer has the words in the process. And this is going to be a dependent clause, where it just adds on extra info to the rest of the sentence, to the noun. Since it's just adding on extra info, you're going to put it between usually two pieces of punctuation. Now this could be like 2 dashes or 2 commas. So if you literally look at our answer choices, there's only one answer that has 2 pieces of punctuation, and that's B. It has 2 commas. Now I'm not really sure how else to explain it. I mean, after doing a ton of these SAT questions, I kind of just have an eye of, seeing when something is a little dependent clause, when it's not important to the main meaning of the sentence and just adding on some extra stuff. So I mean, I guess that's just something you have to develop too. And I'm sure you will do it too. After, doing 39 of these problems, you definitely got that eye too. I also want to point something out really quick. If you look at our text, there's an example of this too. Right here, photons. That is a dependent clause. I guess it only has one word, but it's surrounded by 2 pieces of punctuation. And in this case, it's 2 dashes. Question number 29. Let's look at our answer choices. So here you notice we have a transition word type question. And if you remember our 2 tricks, usually the answer will have a semicolon, and usually that semicolon will come after the transition word. So most likely our answer will be B. But as per usual, let's go ahead and check that. Alright, so I went ahead and plugged in B into our text. And you should remember, whenever the semicolon comes after the transition word, all it's doing is adding on extra info. But most importantly, even outside of these transition questions, you need to remember that semicolons are used to connect two complete sentences. Now keep that in the back of your mind. Let's go ahead and read this and see if it makes sense. Scott Heron himself resisted the Godfather nickname, however. Let me add more details, feeling that it did encapsulate his devotion to the broader blues music tradition, as well as bluesologist, the moniker he preferred. So does it make sense? Yeah, it does. It does add on some more details. He resisted the Godfather nickname, and it gave a reason why. But there's one important thing that you need to notice here. This entire section after the semicolon actually isn't a complete sentence, because there's not a noun and there's not a verb. This is like if I were to say, playing Genshin Impact. Where's the rest of the sentence at? Who's playing Genshin Impact? Now, the right way to say that would be, I was playing Genshin Impact. And notice, your noun would be I, and your verb would be was. So there you go, you have a noun and a verb. But playing Genshin Impact by itself isn't a complete sentence. Once again, a semicolon connects two complete sentences, but since there's not two complete sentences, we can't use a semicolon. So our answer actually won't be B or D. So we know a complete sentence is also called an independent clause. Now, this section that we have, it's missing something. It's depending on a noun and a verb. So you know what we would call that? Well, we would call that a dependent clause. And you should know by now, after going through 28 of these questions, and here's the 29th, you use a comma to separate a dependent clause. So that means our answer will be C, because it has that comma right there to separate this dependent clause that follows right after it. And once again, the dependent clause adds on extra info to the rest of the sentence, to the noun. So we do know that it does add on extra details, so that would make sense. Question number 30, let's look at our answer choices. So here we have another transition word type question. And as you have seen, there can be exceptions, but going with the normal flow, we do note that usually the answer will have a semicolon, and that semicolon will follow the transition word. Which means that most likely our answer is C, but as we have seen in the last question, there are exceptions. So let's go ahead and plug this in to see if it would make sense. Alright, I went ahead and plugged that in. The semicolon is after the transition word, which means it should be adding on extra details. And of course, these should be connecting two complete sentences. So let's go ahead and check. They were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical antiquity, however. That's a complete sentence, and now let me add some more details. Some of the most prominent figures of the earlier Renaissance period were also influenced by ancient Greek and Roman literature. So first up, does it add more details? Does it make sense? Yes, it does. It says that they were not the first to do so, and then gives some example of who was actually the first to do so, or people who did it before them. So yes, it does add more details, that does make sense. And now we need to check, is it a complete sentence? Some of the most prominent figures, that's going to be our noun or our subject. And then we're also influenced, that's going to be our verb. So yes, we do have two complete sentences, and both of them kind of tie off of each other, they both relate to each other. So it would make sense to put a semicolon after the transition word, which means our answer will be C. Question number 31. Let's look at our answer choices. You notice here we have a title, which is biologist, and name, Yuri Lee. Wait, Yuri? Anyways, this is going to be an appositive, and whenever you have an appositive, you never use any punctuation at all, which means our answer will be C. Question number 32. Let's look at our answer choices. So here you notice you only have one answer that has a comma and a fanboy. And whenever you only have one answer choice that has punctuation that connects two independent clauses, that's most likely going to be your answer. So let's go ahead and plug this in and check if that's right. Alright, I went ahead and plugged in our answer choice, and here we have a comma and a fanboy, which obviously connects two complete sentences, so we need to check if we have two complete sentences. So this person right here is going to be our noun, and was is going to be our verb. Now let's look after the comma and the fanboy. He is going to be our noun, and became is going to be our verb. So yes, we have two complete sentences, so we would need that comma and a fanboy to connect those two. Question number 33, let's look at our answer choices. once again we have a title, which is critic, and a name, which is Stina Chin. So a title plus a name is an appositive, and whenever you have an appositive, you never use any punctuation at all. Now this question is a little bit different because they also include the verb in the answer choice, and the verb here is claims. But that still doesn't change anything, alright? You still use no punctuation. So our answer will be C. Question number 34, let's look at our answer choices. So once again, usually I would tell you if you got that semicolon or colon, that's probably going to be your answer. But if you go ahead and plug in your answer choice, I accidentally had caps lock on, I don't feel like changing it. Anyways, you should notice that this is just a part of this guy's name. Architect is the title, and then all of this is the name. So whenever you have a title plus a name, means you have an appositive and you use no punctuation. So that means our answer will be C. Question number 35, let's look at answer choices. We have an appositive question here, we use no punctuation, our answer will be D. Question number 36, let's look at answer choices. So here we have a colon and a dash, and like I've been saying, those are most likely going to be our answer. So first things first, I guess let's plug in A. Alright, I went ahead and plugged in A. Our punctuation here is a colon. And if you don't remember, this is how colons work. You always have a complete sentence before the colon, which means it needs a noun and a verb. And after it can be whatever. You can have a list, an explanation, you can have another complete sentence, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that you have that complete sentence before the colon. So let's check if there's a complete sentence before the colon. Now at the very beginning of the sentence, you'll see this comma right here. So this entire part is actually a modifier or dependent clause. So we won't find our noun or verb in there. The Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture. Alright, so that's our noun, but where's the verb at? There's no verb before the colon. So that's not a complete sentence, which means we can't use a colon. Now I went ahead and plugged in B with the dash, and the way dashes work is that they actually work the exact same way that commas do. So right here you'll notice that whenever you're setting apart a dependent clause, you need a comma. So same thing with a dash, whenever you're setting off a dependent clause, you need a dash. Now if that dependent clause is at the end of a sentence, you only need one dash, because on the other side you would have a period. However, if the dependent clause was in the middle of the sentence, you would need two dashes. So here you'll actually notice that you have one dash here, and you also have your second dash here. So most likely between them, there's a dependent clause, and they use two dashes to set it off. So that means our answer is probably going to be B, but let's quickly check. Is everything in the middle actually a dependent clause? And also, we already know this entire part is the noun, and we also know this, theoretically, should be the dependent clause. So after that dependent clause, we should find our verb. And if we quickly check, became, that is the verb, so that would make the entire thing a complete sentence because you have your noun and your verb. And now let's read everything in the middle. Or Festac 77, as the event was more commonly known. Is that a dependent clause? Does it add more detail? Yeah, it does. It just gives a different name of that festival they just mentioned. So yes, it would make sense to use the dash here. That means our answer will be B. Question number 37, let's look at our answer choices. You notice we have a period and a semicolon, and both of them are like the exact same. They both just have the word plant before them. So they have the exact same function, do the exact same thing. We wouldn't be able to choose between the two of them, which means that neither of them will be the answer. Now we need to choose between using no punctuation versus a colon. And as I've been saying, most likely your answer would never be no punctuation, which means our answer will probably be D. But let's go ahead and plug it in and see if it would make sense. Alright, I went ahead and plugged in our answer choice, and here our punctuation is a colon. Now the way a colon works is that everything before the colon needs to be a complete sentence, so it needs to have a noun and a verb. And then everything after can quite literally be anything, but most commonly it's gonna be an explanation or a list. First up, let's check if everything before the colon is a complete sentence. A group of ecologists, that's going to be our noun. And then they examine something, that's going to be the verb. So yes, we have a complete sentence. Now let's see if everything after the colon would relate to everything before the colon. Like, are they similar to each other? Are they like an explanation of each other? So here we have this group of ecologists that examined the defensive responses of two varieties of the sweet potato plant. And then after the colon, they tell us those two varieties. They say that the first one is TN57, give some info on it, and that the second variety is TN66, and give some info on it. So really, I would say this is a combination of both a list, because they list two things, and an explanation, because they also explain those two things. Anyways, since we do have a complete sense, and then everything after the colon is an explanation, it would make sense to use a colon here, which means the answer would be D. Question number 38, let's look at our answer choices. Here you notice you only have one answer choice that has a colon, so most likely that's going to be our answer. But as per usual, let's go ahead and plug it in and see if it would make sense. Alright, I went ahead and plugged in our answer. Our punctuation here is a colon, which means that everything before it needs to be a complete sense, which means it needs to have a noun and a verb. And then everything after it can be whatever, but usually explanation or list. First up, let's make sure everything before is a complete sense. Researchers, that's going to be our noun. And then have determined is going to be our verb. Now the reason studying magnetosensation isn't our verb is because this is just a modifier. I mean, it's adding on extra info to the researchers. Who are the researchers? Well, specifically, they're people studying magnetosensation. What did they do? Well, they determined something. So yeah, usually ing verbs, those are going to set apart your modifiers. Now, they won't always be in commas, but usually they're also separated by commas. Anyways, everything before is a complete sense. Now let's make sure everything after connects to the first sentence. Make sure it's like an explanation or a list. So before the colon, it says that these researchers found the reason why these roundworms move in the opposite direction of the magnetic field. And then after the colon, it says that in the northern hemisphere, this happens. Then in the southern hemisphere, this happens. So yes, everything after the colon is just an explanation on everything before the colon, so it would make sense to use a colon here. Also, another thing I want to point out is that if you look after the colon, the magnetic field, that's going to be a noun. And then points down, that's going to be a verb. So we actually have two complete sentences here. And if we look back at our answer choices, none of these can connect to complete sentences. The only things that can connect to complete sentences are usually going to be a period, semicolon, or comma and fanboy. But as we know, sometimes there are exceptions and you can also use a colon. So that's another reason why A would be our answer. Question number 39, let's look at our answer choices. So here, most of our answer choices have semicolons, and if we quickly look in the text, we see another semicolon here, which indicates this is a complex list with semicolons. Now, as the name suggests, it's a list with semicolons, so your answer should obviously have a semicolon. However, the problem is, 3 of the answers have semicolons. We can only get rid of 1. Now, just based on the answer choices alone, we won't be able to tell which one is going to be correct. So, we're going to use a different method, which is checking parallel structure. Basically, we're going to see how they use punctuation in the text and then apply it to our answer choice. So if we look at the text real quick, you'll notice that they have the date and then after it, a semicolon. Now here they have the date and after it, a period. But we know that both of these are basically going to be the exact same. It's just saying that after the date, it's the end of that item in the list. Now if we look at all of our answer choices, there's only one answer that has a semicolon after the date, so that means that C will be our answer. Alright, that was 39 practice problems on punctuation. Wow, what a journey. I mean, I took a 3-month break between recording this video, so you can literally tell when I got a new mic because I got a new headset. Anyways, it's great to be back, but of course, punctuation can be really easy if you know all the rules, but as you can see, there's a lot of rules that you needed to go through, so let me quickly recap all of them. First up, in these sentences with complex lists with semicolons, as long as there's a semicolon in your answer choices and another one in the text, that's an indicator. And then, to know the correct answer, just copy the way they use punctuation in the text. Right here, they have the name of the station or whatever, the date, and then the semicolon. So here you would have the name of the station, the date, and then the semicolon. For colons, just remember everything before needs to be a complete sentence, a noun and a verb, and everything after can be whatever. Remember that periods and semicolons are the exact same, so you can cross them out because they're doing the exact same thing. You wouldn't be able to choose between the two of them. For dashes, most of the time if you see another dash in the text, you're most likely going to need to pair it with a second dash because you need to put a dependent clause between two dashes. My lovely appositive questions. Title plus a name means you use no punctuation at all. Now that means no punctuation in the middle, no punctuation before, and no punctuation after. Common to fanboy connects to complete sentences. Most of the time for these transition word type questions, the semicolon will come after the transition word. But just remember, this won't always be the case. I'll link a second secret link of punctuation questions, and in one of those questions, the semicolon actually comes before the transition word. Now I recorded that video like 2 years ago, so my explanation on it was pretty bad, but if you apply what I've been saying in this video to that question, it should also make a lot of sense. Whenever you have a semicolon after the transition word, everything after the semicolon is just adding on extra info to the first part, or everything before the semicolon. If you have the semicolon before the transition word, everything after the semicolon should relate to the transition word. Now, I don't know how else to say it, but what I'm trying to say is, in this question, our transition word is however. However is used to contrast two different things. So it's saying two things are the opposite of each other. So when I'm saying that everything after the semicolon should have the transition word applied to it, I'm saying that everything after the transition word should be the opposite of everything before. But let's say we had a different transition word. Let's say we had the transition word for example. Everything after the transition word should be an example of everything before the transition word, if you catch my flow. Here's one of those exceptions where you don't use a semicolon, and the reason is because a semicolon is used to connect two complete sentences. If you don't have a complete sentence, you can't use a semicolon. Now here's another transition type question where they don't use semicolons, but the idea still applies. It's just the punctuation coming after the transition word. Same thing here for this complex list. Look at parallel structure. You have the italicized name of something and then a comma after it. Italicized name, comma after it. Now if you look at A, it also has an italicized name and a comma after it, but it's a list with semicolons, so where's the semicolon at in A? That's why it's not the answer. For this one, whenever you have a list with only two items, you don't need to use any punctuation between the two. Alright, and I just went through all the questions. That looks like that's gonna be everything you need to know. One final thing that isn't really like a specific thing to any question, whenever you have a piece of punctuation that connects two independent clauses, like a period, semicolon, or a comma and a fanboy, that's most likely going to be your answer, as well as sometimes having a colon or a dash. Why? The whole point of the punctuation part in the SAT is to test if you know how to use punctuation, so obviously they would use those specific types of punctuation in specific cases. Now of course the opposite would also apply. There are specific cases where you use no punctuation, like in appositives, but those are a lot rarer. Anyways, I know that was a lot of rules, but that's gonna be all. Good luck studying, and I'll see you. Wait, the video is almost at 1 hour, 23 minutes, and 45 seconds. Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so let me stop for a bit.